Hello, and welcome to the Scientista podcast, where women and science rule. This podcast is all about supporting powerful women who lead with their brains. I'm former Assistant Secretary of State Monica Medina. Unfortunately, Shetta Chakrabarty, my co host, can't be with us today, but we're going to keep going and try and power through without her. The Scientista podcast brings you conversations with leaders, change makers, cultural figures, sharing how they're turning facts and evidence into real world impact. So let's dive in. Today, our guest is Holly Kaufman, the co founder of the Plastics and Climate Project and senior fellow at World Resources Institute. She and Dr. Alice Zhu, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Ocean Sciences at the University of Newfoundland, recently published a report entitled Plastics Exposing Their Climate Impacts: What We Know, What We Need to Know, and Recommendations for Research and Policy. The report has been widely covered in the media, and what they found is shocking but not surprising given the proliferation of plastic pollution and plastic in general in society and in the environment. So thank you so much, Holly. It's great to see you. Thank you for joining us today. And we're sorry that Alice couldn't be here as well. I know she is busy today and couldn't make it, but her research, I know, was a huge part of the report and its success. So hats off to her.
Thank you.
So we always start, Holly, with a question, and welcome. We always start with a question about how our guests got their start. Tell us about your path to climate change policy and now plastic pollution. You have decades of experience in climate and environmental policy at all levels in government, in NGOs, in business, and in philanthropy in the private sector. You live in San Francisco. You've been a climate activist there. Tell us about how you got started on this road to climate change, climate pollution, and plastic pollution now.
Well, thank you. And it's really an honor to be here and to follow from all of the incredible guests that you have. And I appreciate you crediting Alice as well, because she is our science half. So I appreciate that. Well, when I first saw that you were going to ask me this question, I immediately thought about my grandparents. And I think, much to their dismay, probably, since they would have wanted me to be a pharmacist or an accountant or something. But they're the ones who really got me to appreciate nature and not to waste things. Um, so my grandmother used to hold up a flower, or I remember a persimmon, which is very heavy, and she would comment on how that little tiny stem could hold it up. And so because of her, I actually wrote a little children's book called How Can One Earth? Because she would always
Gosh,
say,
we have to go find it. A children's book.
it's not published, but one day it's sitting here.
Someday.
But
Should be.
she would always say, how can one earth produce so many different flavors and colors and smells?
What a great
And it was
question. How can one Earth be so diverse?
Isn't that amazing? I just loved that. So I credit my grandparents. And then I remember when I was about 10 years old, the top of the fold of the San Francisco Chronicle, the paper my parents always got back when people read newspapers, was about the California condor and how it was going extinct. And there were just a couple left in the wild. And I had never heard of extinction. And even though the condor is got to be the ugliest bird on the planet, I was just crestfallen, not to use a pun, but how humans could make a whole species go extinct. So those were a couple of the things that led me to waking up one morning when I was 17 years old and deciding I'm going to save the earth. So that hasn't quite happened yet, but I've been trying hard ever since. And I was very fortunate in my undergraduate degree. At UC Berkeley, I got to experiment with a lot of different things in the environmental arena, both hands-on and sort of policy-wise, back before it was even called environmental policy. And I guess eventually landed in climate change because it was such a looming threat. And then I accidentally fell into plastics and started to see the importance of connecting the two.
I think the world kind of backed into the plastics problem, thinking it was this great, very convenient thing. And now it's sort of the it's huge. It's just overtaken so much of our lives, and we can't even really conceive of living without it. But let's take a
And yet
step.
there's so many things from when we were younger where we didn't have plastics. I mean, why wrap a banana in plastic? It's absurd.
Or an apple, or
Right.
today I got a children's toy that came in a box that was also wrapped in plastic, and I'm like, why? Anyway,
I'll tell you why, but we'll get to that.
we'll get to that. Let's set the stage first about climate, because we've had a lot of climate guests on, but we haven't had anyone who really has sort of taken a step back and talked to us about where we are in the climate crisis. And given how long your career has been in climate, you were a climate negotiator in the US government many, many years ago, and you worked on so much of the precursors of what has turned into the Paris Agreement and now its implementation. So, talk to us about where we are in addressing the climate crisis and what are we missing? Because I think that's part of the story on plastic that that you found. So, where are we in climate? How are we doing?
Well, what comes to mind is our friend Christiana Figueres's and her colleagues' podcast, Outrage and Optimism. I just think that sums it up pretty well because it is outrageous that we are where we are. We've come a long way. We have made a lot of progress, but we are failing miserably at the same time. And so, depending on the day, you can feel both outrage and optimism. I mean, I've worked in business, I've worked for major corporations, I've worked in small business. As you mentioned earlier, I've worked in all sectors. And I was really hoping at one point in my career, when I first went to go work for a major corporation, that when you aligned profits with environmental benefit, that then we'd really make headway. And then I saw that that wasn't working. And then when I went to work at the Defense Department, I thought, okay, if we really align national security with the environment, that's going to really make the difference. And the US Department of Defense was all over energy management and other things that would be good for the climate in many ways, but then Congress was holding them up. So, I just think I've gotten to the point of going back to my sort of naive 17-year-old self, which was that it comes down to the profit system in the fossil fuel industry. And the fossil fuel industry is
Yeah.
engaged in multiple sectors, in energy and transportation, in agriculture and now plastics. And we subsidize the fossil fuel industry around the world to the tune of trillions of dollars. And it's just not viable. And despite all of the progress we've made in renewable energy, which is now just energy, it used to be alternative energy. Now it's just energy in EVs, et cetera. We're still thousands of people around the world are dying all the time from storms and droughts and hurricanes and the like.
Yeah, there's a major storm hitting a small island as we speak, and it just breaks your heart. Tell us about the gaps in data. One of the things I think that the climate deniers like to do is point out the gaps in the climate data. And in fact, that, was a way that plastic kind of went unseen in the climate crisis for so long. Talk about what are the gaps? What are our blind spots?
Well, if you're talking specifically about plastics, that is what actually the essence of our work was. So Alice and I formed the Plastics and Climate Project because both of us independently were the only people we found who had had the same idea, which was, we know that there's links between plastics and climate. We know that plastics, that industry, is responsible for 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but that is not counting all of them. I'll come back to that.
And we're not even counting all of them. That's
We're
a
not counting all of that.
big
And that's
number in the scheme of climate emissions and impacts.
with only the emissions that we count, which are largely from production, where the plastics production is similar to other heavy fossil fuel industries and where some combustion is involved. We count those, and we count some from certain forms of waste management, like incineration. We do not count the greenhouse gas impacts from plastics through the entire plastics life cycle, which is a life cycle that never ends.
Right.
Because
It's forever.
99% of plastics are synthetic fossil fuel plastics, and nature cannot absorb them. They never go away. So just the emissions we count are 5%, which puts it at, if the plastics industry were a country, about the fourth largest emitter after China, the US, and India. 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions is twice the aviation industry at present, which is about 2.5%. So the undercounted climate impacts from plastics in themselves are significant. They are undercounted and they are growing. That is one of my messages. Significant, undercounted, growing. So data gaps, that was your question. We count those two ends of the life cycle, as I said. We do not count import and export. We do not count transport. We do not count use, which I'll come back to, and we do not count emissions from unmanaged waste. So if you think of use, plastics, when they're just sitting there, especially if they've been hit by UV light, depending on the combination of ingredients and polymers in the plastics,
And there's
emit
many of those. It's hard to
many,
even.
many. Right. Think foam insulation is constantly emitting F gases, fluorinated F, very high potent
Yikes.
foaming. Right. Vinyl windows and doors are emitting greenhouse gases. The oceanographer who discovered by accident that when a polyethylene just thin grocery bag, once it's been hit by sunlight, UV light, and it starts to degrade, break down in water, but it also happens on land, that it emits ethylene, which is a greenhouse gas, not as potent, and methane. This is not counted. So this is a huge data gap. And then there are also two other categories of climate impacts where we have even less data, and that is plastics' impact to carbon sinks and plastics' impact to what's called the radiation budget, which is the exchange of energy between the Earth and the atmosphere.
So we're going to jump into that first one right now, which is one of the biggest revelations coming out of your study, which is that plastic pollution is disrupting the Earth's carbon cycle. And that, covers a wide spectrum of things that you talked about, including microplastics and nanoplastics. And that those plastics in the environment are hurting or interfering with the planet's natural ability to absorb and store it. So give us, examples, play that out a little bit farther for us.
We'll do that.
How much of a problem is it?
Right. So let me just back up, and I want to make just clear a definition that we like to use. We like to make a distinction between plastic waste and plastic pollution. Waste is the visible plastic that you can see, right? When the plastic issues first started to really get attention, when we'd see all this plastic in
Yes.
the ocean, but is probably only 1% of what's actually in the ocean because it's all the little micro and
Micro
nano
pieces. Because again, as you said, it never goes away. It may break down to a million jillion pieces,
breaks apart. Yes.
yes,
Right.
but it's not gone.
No. And that includes textile fibers, paint, tires, tire crumble, etc. Okay, so there's a difference between plastic waste, what's discarded or unused, and plastic pollution, which takes many forms and goes through the entire life cycle. So plastic pollution is chemical pollution, it's micro and nanoplastics, it's chemicals, it's greenhouse gas emissions. There's lots of kinds of plastic pollution through the whole life cycle. So now that I've said that, I'll come back to plastics interference with the carbon cycle. So, as I said, we did this massive literature review to see what data exists about plastics climate impacts and what data is missing. So, there is clear data on plastics, the fact that plastics interference with the carbon cycle, meaning the part of it is the sequestration or the ability for natural systems to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. It is affecting the carbon cycle in ways that increase warming. It looks like plastics are interfering with what's called the biological carbon pump, which is we have all these little critters, tiny microscopic plants and animals that in their different ways take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in the deep ocean.
It's an amazing thing. Just stop and think about that these tiny little creatures swimming through the ocean that are microscopic or very, very small, absorbing huge amounts of carbon. They're the things that are pulling it out of the atmosphere and then taking it down to the deepest part of the ocean. What an amazing, natural thing that is.
My grandmother. Right. We could not invent that technology, right? This is what we call a free ecosystem service, right? And so nature provides all these ecosystem services upon which all life and commerce, by the way, i.e. profits, depend. So we know that these microscopic plants, marine phytoplankton, that the microplastics are affecting their health. We also know that the zooplankton, the animal microorganisms, are ingesting microplastics. We have photographs where you can actually see the.
Gosh. So these tiny little things, you have pictures of them from this lit survey. You found scientists who had discovered that in these tiny little creatures, they can see the plastic, the nanoplastics inside them.
So, yes. So we know that plastic is interfering with their metabolism, with their ability to reproduce, and with their survival. We do not yet know, though, the significance of this. Like, it seems really important, but how much is it killing off zooplankton and phytoplankton? We really need to know this. So this is a really important area for more scientific research. We know more in the phytoplankton than in the zooplankton, as in with the plants, more than with the little animals. So, soil is also another very important
Place,
sink
yeah, where
for
carbon's stored, right?
place where carbon can be stored, right? And so here there are some conflicting studies. There are studies that show that all the microplastics which are accumulating in soil, because it's landing from the air, from all the agricultural plastics, from all the PVC, piping, from irrigation. There are some studies that show that where there is a concentration of micro nanoplastics in the soil, that the community of soil microorganisms, of the little microscopic animals in the soil, are converting from these that absorb carbon to ones that do not. There
Goodness,
are
that's
there are
not good.
studies that contradict this. So we don't know this yet, but again, really important to find out.
Yeah.
We do know, though, that with all the plastics in the soil, that it's changing soil respiration, which, if you don't know that technical doesn't matter, basically that soil is like exhaling more carbon dioxide and methane.
Yeah, anybody who has a lawn knows they come and they aerate your lawn in order to get it to grow. That's part of
Right.
what makes it fertile is that soil has that capacity.
So, one area that really interests me where I think it's important that we have more data is, we are spending time and energy doing what's called like restoring natural habitats in order to increase carbon sequestration by planting trees, by restoring wetlands and seagrasses, etc. So, we need to understand how much micro nanoplastics are interfering with that carbon sequestration so that those efforts are actually as beneficial as we want them to be.
Yeah, I mean, carbon sequestration is kind of the answer to so many of our carbon problems, our greenhouse gas emission problems, is keeping as much as we can sequestered and trying to sequester more in ways that are not harmful. So,
But we
gosh,
already know, plastics aside, that oceans and forests are losing their capacity to do this job for us
forests, which is really,
because of there's so much CO2 in the atmosphere. Like, we used to hear the argument, well, all this increased CO2 is going to help grow more plants.
yeah.
But it that we've reached a point where they can't take in this
I
much.
can't do it. So, another big revelation from the study, important finding from your study, was having to do with the Earth's radiation budget. So, tell us what the radiation budget is, how does it work, and what's the significance of that when it comes to climate change? Because we know the planet has a fever, and we know that we're trying to get the fever to break, and it sounds like this is going in the opposite direction.
Right. Or as somebody else calls it, a blanket of pollution keeping the planet warm. We need to take the blanket off. So the radiation budget sounds fancy, but it's not. It's basically just the exchange of energy between the Earth and the atmosphere. So sunlight and energy that goes back and forth. But some of the elements that are involved in this exchange of energy are clouds, are albedo, which is the reflectivity of the Earth.
Snow, think snow reflects, right?
Snow and ice, exactly. So, this is actually the area of these three categories of impacts: greenhouse gases, carbon sinks, and the radiation budget, where we know the least. There have only been 5 studies in this area, right? There's very little information. We know that micro nanoplastics are in clouds because they are everywhere. As you and I are speaking, we are breathing in plastics. We are wearing plastics and absorbing chemicals through our skin. There's something now called the plastosphere, which is the fact that there are tiny little aerosolized bits of plastics throughout the air and the atmosphere. And these are moisture collects around them, diseases and
Golly.
toxins adhere to them. So we have a whole new sphere now called the plastosphere.
Think why people are angry. But, a lot of
But
consumers and, moms who care about health are really worried about these impacts of plastic and they can kind of see it. It's not like you can see these things, but you can feel the amount of plastic waste just sort of piling up around us. And I think everybody is waking up to the fact that it's not just what we see, it's literally everywhere.
Right. So that is absolutely true. It is, it's a cliche now, but it's from the bottom of the deepest part of the ocean to the highest mountains, but it's also in every ecosystem, in every creature, including human beings. So back to the radiation budget. I'll just finish on that. So with moisture forming around these little particles inside of clouds, it looks like we are increasing precipitation, rain and snow. So that's weather, that's not climate. But because of climate, as we know, we've got much more intense rainfall that tends to hang out over one area and dump a lot more water. And that's why one of the reasons why we have a lot of flooding. So in this case, we don't really need to be adding to that. The other thing is that with all the light and dark particles of different plastics and plastic fibers, etc., they may be increasing the reflectivity of the earth, which might have a minor cooling
I was
impact.
going to say that
Like
might be good, right?
I wouldn't get too excited about it. I don't think we want to spread, um, you know, light plastic everywhere to try to increase because of all the other toxic, carcinogenic, endocrine disrupting, and climate impacts of plastics. That wouldn't be a good idea. But it might have a similar trade off to, say, how soot, black carbon or volcanic eruptions can have a slight cooling effect. But as I said, jury is really out. So don't go carrying that one to the bank. At the same time, the opposite, depending again on light and dark particle distribution, with dark particles on snow and ice, they might be increasing the melt rate of glaciers. So I'm putting all this out there to say there have been 5 studies done here. These are some of the possible effects, but this area is where we know the least. We know the most about the greenhouse gases, sort of medium about the carbon cycling impacts, and the least about this. And we need more research in all of them.
So that gets me to my next question, which is what did you all recommend? Because you didn't just study, examine the problem and, admire the problem. You have some recommendations, which is really important because we want to get our arms around these problems, not just understand that they're there. But how do we solve this one? What do you guys think?
Thank you. Good. Well, we made both science and sort of policy action recommendations. So, for people who want more on the science, I highly recommend you go to our website, www.plasticsandclimate.com.
www.plasticsandclimate.com.
There you go. Wallpaper that. And there you will be able to see our peer-reviewed paper and our summary report, both of which go into the scientific research agenda that we recommend for all 3 categories of impacts. But for all 3 categories, our suggestion is that experiments be done with real world conditions because a lot of the studies are done with only one color of plastic or one polymer. And there's very little information, by the way, on bioplastics. We only looked at the fossil fuel plastics. So all of this research needs to take place for the, huge circus and that is bioplastics, because those aren't really defined. So anyway, real world conditions are important. On the policy front, with COP30 coming up, the next
Very
round of
soon, just around the corner.
very soon in Brazil, with the next round of climate treaty negotiations coming up, we have specific recommendations for the UN climate regime. And our policy briefer for that, it's only 2 pages, is also on our website, which I encourage people to look at. But basically, we would very much like countries to ask for at the COP that the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's largest body, as we know, UN body of global scientists working on climate, that they, in their next major assessment report, which is the 7th one, every number of years, they come together and look at all the scientific information that's come out on climate and then produce an assessment. We really want the climate impacts of plastics included in AR7 and the possibility of the IPCC doing a special report on the climate impacts
And
of
their special
plastics.
reports have been really impactful. They've done a few in the past that have really moved the needle on things like
Yes.
understanding the cryosphere and oceans. And given the importance of plastic, the UN has highlighted it this year. It was, kind of the signature issue in World Environment Day, et cetera, et cetera. You would think that it would be really common sense to connect these dots and to
Mm.
integrate plastic into the IPCC's work.
Yeah.
But
Particularly, sorry, I
no,
didn't mean to
but
cut you off.
what's standing in the way? Why isn't that just like of course.
Well, one is, I mean, part of our work right now is that we need to keep getting the word out because not enough people are really aware of the connections between plastics and climate change. So, that's sort of job number one for us that we hope, now that we've produced the peer reviewed paper and the summary report, and now we're doing these policy briefers for the different various treaty negotiations because they need to link all the issues and not be siloed. We are really trying to get the word out so that people understand that plastics have climate impacts, that they're significant, undercounted, and growing, that even if we stopped all plastic production, use, and waste today, many of the climate impacts would not only continue, but continue to increase, precisely because all these little bits of plastics are out there forever, affecting carbon sinks and emitting greenhouse gases. So we want these things we need delegations to call for the IPCC to include these. We need the SBSTA, which is the body related to the climate negotiations that works on scientific and provides scientific and technological advice. If the SBSTA could potentially work with some private sector bodies or with the new United Nations Environment
Program,
Assembly,
right? Yes. UNEP.
UNEP has stood up it's called, I have to look up the precise words because I always forget, the Intergovernmental Science and Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste, and Pollution. So,
Yeah, that's an
at any
easy
rate,
one to remember.
yeah, I had to write that one down. At any rate, we need scientific and technical bodies like that who work on accounting methodologies to start to figure out how do we account for these impacts. Even before we have all of the scientific data, what are reasonable assumptions that we can make about these impacts so that they're included in climate models, which they currently are not, so that they're included in IPCC emission scenarios, which they currently are not, right?
Yeah, I
So
mean,
that
could it be as basic as putting plastic waste measures into country plans, into their domestic plans on.
yes, we need to have it be in country inventories and reporting. So that's another UN recommendation that for the next round of what's called nationally determined contributions, NDCs, which are basically like the promise note that countries give to the UN to say, we're going to reduce our emissions by X amount by X date. Here's what we're going to do on climate. So, and those are due every 5 years per the Paris Agreement. Right now at COP30, that's coming up a couple of weeks in Brazil, that's when this batch of NDCs are due. The next batch is 5 years from now. So we have time to do some of the research and to figure out some good assumptions for, accounting so that companies, subnational governments, states, and countries can at least start to, account for and report on the climate impacts of plastics in their countries.
So
So those are our asks, UN.
those are good asks. And again, thinking about the fact that the amount of plastics in the environment is increasing, the impact on climate change from plastic, as you say, is increasing, and we don't even really have a good handle on it. So these are important things for us to really be taking on board and trying to fix. And one of the ways we were trying to fix it was through a plastics treaty like the climate treaty. And that unfortunately fell apart. The negotiations on that had been going on for about 3 years. They fell apart last August. Do you think connecting the dots with climate could actually help build political will for both, better accounting in climate and for this treaty on plastics? What do you think? Do you think in just the way that it's bad synergistically in the environment, maybe the connection between these two things could help buoy both?
So the answer is yes and no. So I think that, our findings that we hope that the UN, the IPCC really build on because, we've done the literature review, and I didn't mention we've also done an extensive free online bibliography of resources on the plastics and climate nexus divided by impact
Wow, which is
category.
really important for researchers because they can then go find what took you guys years to compile.
Right. So anybody can go to
One
that, and
easy
actually we
place.
need more funding to keep that going because it takes a lot of work to stay on top of all the papers. So funders out there, help me
Help us.
make that happen and all the rest of the work that we're doing. Anyway, so as far as the plastics treaty, yes, our information is already helping to arm advocates of a strong and enforceable plastics treaty with more information. I think that it will help all of the activists and the countries who are for a strong and enforceable plastics treaty. I think it could make things actually even harder for the fossil fuel interests, like my country, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the what are they called? The like-minded states who were against the treaty and caused all destruction in the last round at INC 5.2, because the plastics treaty is a fossil fuel treaty. Because 99% of plastics, as I said, are
Made
made
from
from fossil
fossil fuels,
and chemicals.
carbon.
And an important point to make is that as we have made some progress on the climate front with renewable energy and electric vehicles and the like, the fossil fuel industry sees demand for its conventional products decreasing. So they are have pivoted to plastics and petrochemicals, where they are looking at least tripling production of
Tripling.
plastic.
And it's
Yes,
already
tripling production by
exponentially
2050.
grown, like in just our lifetimes. Yours and
We already have an overproduction of plastics, right? We want to match the lifetime of plastic with the use of plastic, right? As we hopefully ultimately develop replacements for fossil fuel plastics that are long lasting. But for the time being, let's use plastics for things like airplane parts and car parts and things that are going to last 20, 30 years, but not for a candy wrapper where you open it and you toss it after 5 minutes, right?
water bottle you
No.
use once.
Yes, which is killing you too. I was at the doctor's the other day, and when I was done, they handed me a plastic bottle of water. I'm like, you're just handing me, carcinogens and chemicals that I don't want to swallow. No, thank you. So as I was saying that, with this pivot to plastics and petrochemicals, those countries, those interests are not going to welcome this information, but it's really important to have out there. And we don't need to put and shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket, that is, in the UN Plastics Treaty basket. I think it's really important we all keep working on that, but there are many other ways to reduce the impacts of plastics in terms of health and climate and ecosystem health, and reducing plastic production that don't require a treaty, which even if it did, was
Even if
passed,
there
would
was a
take a
negotiation and the words got agreed, it would take a long time for the
time to
treaty.
come into force and to be implemented. So we need to keep doing everything we can to remove fossil fuel subsidies, right? To prevent permits from being allowed for expansion of plants in places like Cancer Alley in Louisiana and Appalachia and other places where, plastic is being made.
So, I mean, not to put to put words in your mouth, but what I thought you said was, listen, plastic isn't a demonic thing that, is killing the world. It's a substance, there are things that should be used for it that are used over and over again that have long-term benefits if we use them properly. But we don't need all the plastic we have. And to the extent that we are going to have plastic, we need to understand the climate impacts of that.
Absolutely, because they will only keep growing. As I said, even if we stopped all production today.
Even if we stopped all production today, impacts from the plastic that already exists in the environment will continue and will increase. If I heard you right, yes?
Correct. Many of them will increase. Not all, but many will. Yes. I mean, if we stopped all production today, the impacts from the greenhouse gases from production, for example, and if we stopped burning plastic, which is terrible, those would stop immediately. But the other impacts from the other climate impacts would continue and continue to increase. So one of our other actionable items is calling for transparency for what is in plastics,
Yeah,
right? Because there are over
because we
16,000
don't
different
know.
chemicals in plastic, most of which have never been tested. We do not employ the precautionary principle before we put things out broadly on the marketplace. We have no idea about how these plastics work in combination. We do know that when they're heated, like in recycling or other processes, that then they can form, benzenes and other really dangerous substances. So we need to know, and that's another thing that plastic and climate and health and other advocates can call for. Firms who produce these things say that this information is proprietary, but I'm sorry, it's affecting public health and our survival. We need to know what's in this
So
stuff.
this is the kind of thing that consumers can do. And not only will it help them with their health and their kids, their reproductive organs, that are being impacted. There's so many impacts. And this is one place where consumers can help make a change. You know,
Well, I tried to do it yesterday, in fact. So my daughter's moved to a snowy part of the country and hasn't lived there before. I need to get her winter boots. I'm trying hard to get her snow boots that do not have PFAS in them. PFAS is a very common ingredient, an additive in plastics, and it's used for waterproofing. So I'm trying to find snow boots with no PFAS. So I called a major manufacturer that's based in Maine that makes, hardy snow boots. And they said, which I was really pleased, they are phasing out PFAS. Any of their new products do not have any PFAS compounds. But there's a waterproof liner in their, new line of snow boots. Great. What makes it waterproof? I've said. It's proprietary. It's our own brand of Gore-Tex. Gore-Tex, don't buy Gore-Tex. Gore-Tex is PFAS. It's the Teflon. So so they wouldn't tell me what was in it. And so I said, I'm sorry, I can't buy these unless you tell me what's in it because I won't put them on my daughter's feet.
yeah, I think consumers have power when they demand, especially when it's based on health, not some, aesthetic thing, but because it's really impacting our health, consumers can have an awful lot of power. And that's I think, a really great place for us to sort of pivot to our last question, which is all about how you've dealt with adversity. We always ask, our guests to tell us a story about a time when they hit a roadblock or got a curveball in their career, something they didn't really anticipate. And particularly women, I think, are struggle sometimes when you hit these roadblocks or speed bumps. And so tell us, particularly from the perspective of someone who's been one of the very few women in the room at the negotiating table, doing this work. Tell us how you would advise young women. You have a daughter, in this category,
Turned 18.
as
Mhm.
do I. So, how would you advise them when they hit a roadblock in their career? What did you do? Tell us a story about a time when you hit one.
Well, I feel like I'm up against one now, so I've had to take my own advice. That's a really great question to ask people. Well, first of all, I want to say, um, I actually think there've been a lot of women in the room in this regard. You certainly are one of them, and Sheta, and Cristiana, and Laurence Tubiana, and Marina Silva, and there have been a lot of women working on the climate issues. So kudos to all of them. And, I think most things come down to relationships that a lot of times, and I have felt this lately, that we feel like we're sort of pushing a rock uphill by ourselves. And yes, we can tell ourselves to persevere and keep going. But I think, I think any success I've had in any realm of my life has had to do with building relationships. You can call it networking, but it's just really always sort of continuing to build your relationships, to be kind. I think kindness is really important, to help people, to ask for help, and to thank the people who help you and offer to help them back. So, and I think the more that then we can kind of team up with other people and find ways to collaborate. Like I'm working with a group now. I do not agree with them on all of their issues, but we definitely have common ground on this one. So we're trying to each other in that. And I think That helps all of our work and it helps all of our emotional well-being.
That's such great advice. We've gotten it from a couple of our other guests, and networking doesn't really cover it. Networking sounds so superficial. It really is
Sort of
building
technical.
relationships. It's building the kind of relationship where you can actually call someone and say, I need your help. Or they'll call you and ask for your help. And that's where I think the real magic happens in, helping each other. And
Right. Or even just to say, I'm feeling really stuck on this. I thought you'd be a good person to brainstorm with. Do you have 20 minutes now or can I schedule some time with you? I think it's so helpful to get input from other people and to be there to then reciprocate and do it for them.
that's wonderful advice. Holly, thank you so much. This has been such a
Thank
great
you.
conversation. We
Really
know
great.
that
Thank
your
you.
career of climate activism, and particularly this latest chapter, your report on plastic pollution and plastic in the environment and how it's impacting climate change, not for the better, for the worse, has been really a groundbreaker actually in this field. And you've gotten a lot of wonderful notice for it. And I hope that you have a very successful COP and you're able to get some of the recommendations you're seeking into the COP decision. And thank you all for listening to this podcast. Recommend us widely. We really, really appreciate your support. You can always find us at scientista.world for more stories, updates, and ways to get involved. Thank you again, Holly. Good luck at COP.
Thank you so much. Thank you.